Let's talk about the economic. Boy, I tell you what, it's a good day to come talk to you about hog prices. 99.45 today was the high on the June contract, and so I know all of you are saying, well, I'm going to wait until it's 120 before I sell. But we're going to talk about this whole thing. Will you make money this year? Well, I'm going to give you the standard economist answer. That depends. Okay? And largely it depends on your behavior and what actions you take. Because the market is offering you profits right now. Now, if you want to get greedy and hope you get more, or if you need to get greedy and hope you get more, that's a different question. But it really depends on a lot of things, and it depends on a lot of factors in the world. In this business, Ron Plain always said the number one rule of forecasting is forecast often. Okay? And this week has been living proof of that. I mean, last week we didn't know that Korea was going to slash their tariffs to 0 for the first 6 months of the year. I mean, I think this is great that a government actually cares about the food costs of their people. All right? Instead of protecting a domestic industry. And so that's what they're going to do. And that's one of the reasons we had April hogs up the limit today and June hogs at $99 and change. And so there are a lot of things that change, and there could be a lot of things change yet. A couple years ago, I stood here in January and I spent the whole spring saying this, these futures markets look pretty good, but they normally peak out the second week of May. What happened the last week of April? H1N1. Yeah. So, you need to be thinking about, what do I need? How much do I need to make in order to stay in this business? We're still playing defense, I think. And the reason we're still playing defense is mainly because of grains and cost of production. Demand, both domestic and foreign, we're going to talk about that today. That's a real positive in the market right now. No question about it. Supply response has been muted so far. Some trade-offs as we went through the fall. Are we going to start building the breeding herd? Well, I don't think we got enough prophets looking at this thing right yet to start building much of a breeding herd. But I do know that you guys are really good at that last one, and that's productivity. And we will increase productivity. This industry is still a long ways from being where it can be genetically with the animals and management-wise if we look at the Europeans. Somebody asked me one time, why don't we raise as many pigs as the Europeans raise per sow? And the reason was, we don't have to. That was back when feed was cheap. Well, that's not the case anymore. And so we're going to see productivity responses pretty steadily as we go forward. Let's talk about our old friend ethanol. Now, I will repeat, some people say I don't like ethanol. That is not true. I really like it in oaken barrels and long neck bottles. Okay? But cars just aren't my cup of tea. Ethanol will compete successfully with corn this year regardless of policy issues. $100 oil, $3 plus gasoline, $4 and change per million BTUs or whatever they measured in on gas, and they can buy corn for more than for as much or more than what you want to pay for it. I guarantee it. So that's an important thing to remember this year. They're going to compete successfully. They got 210 plants. They can make about 14.1 billion gallons this year. If they got the full output of these expansions that were still under construction back in this would have been October of last year, according to Ethanol Producer Magazine, they could use about 5 billion bushels of corn. All right, now let's keep those numbers in mind. Notice also that cellulosic is less than 1% of the total. Remember, that's going to be the savior, and that's going to be the future of the ethanol business. And it still isn't economical. It still isn't really feasible. And so it's not developing very well. Ethanol plants are back in the black for now. They may have gone red in the last couple of weeks. This is from Iowa State. But notice that they're still not making any big money. This is break-even covering fixed costs. And this is still an excess capacity business. So we can increase the output of ethanol, drive the price of ethanol down, drive the price of corn up anytime that there's profits there and bid those profits away. It's a classic zero economic profit business. Nearby corn at $6.19, ethanol at $2.34, natural gas at $4.48, and they're in the black. All right, so they can compete pretty well for corn. The renewable fuel standard goes up at a rate of 600 million gallons per year for the next 4 years. That's slower than it has been. So we're not getting as big a draw of corn out for ethanol per year as we have been, but it's still growing. So we're going to have to produce more corn. Now, 12 billion gallons this year, 4.3 billion bushels of corn would make that 12 billion gallons, okay? Let's keep that in mind. USDA says we're going to use 4.9 billion bushels of corn for ethanol this year. That's my point. If they waive the renewable fuel standard, it doesn't make any difference. They're already using more corn than what the renewable fuel standard causes them to do this year. So it's not binding, as we economists would say. It's not a binding constraint on the system. This year, they can go on. So, as much as, and one of these days, we're going to get a situation where we have a short crop and lower, not low, but lower oil prices, and that's going to say waive the renewable fuel standard, because economics would say don't make it into ethanol. But this is not one of those years. Economics says that they're going to compete very well for corn as we go through this year. So, important policy decisions have been made. I forgot to change the slide. 15% blend allowance, of course, was announced last week that it now applies to 2001 models and newer. It's still an allowance. It's not a requirement. And I don't think there's going to be much uptake. They don't have the tanks. They don't have the pumps. They don't have the logistics. They're still concerned about liability. I don't think we're going to see this come into play, especially with the economics in their favor at the present time. The blender's tax credit and import tariff were renewed for a year. Now, the important thing about a 1-year renewal happening in the fall of 2010 means that the next time we talk about this in the fall of 2011 will be right in the middle of the Iowa presidential caucus campaigns. And how many think that the presidential candidates are going to come here and say that they're against ethanol? Yep. That'll be a pretty short campaign, I think. Okay? So that's the important thing. And then we have this thing about Al Gore. Okay? All right? You remember Al Gore. He's the guy that invented the internet and discovered global warming. Last fall, and I really thought that these statements might be the kiss of death for the blender's tax credit. I really did. It's not good policy to have these massive subsidies for first generation, that's starch-based ethanol. The energy conversion ratios are at best very small. The percentage of corn being used for ethanol definitely has an impact on food prices. World Food FAO, food prices worldwide up 20%. Now, 20% rise in food prices for most of the people in this room is probably not that big a deal. But somebody living in Somalia or Ethiopia or somewhere, a 20% rise in food prices is a pretty serious issue. That might be the difference between life and death. I mean, this is not just a thing about what we put in our cars. Next one. I had a certain fondness for farmers in Iowa because I was about to run for president. I think translated says I did it for the votes, okay? And so, I mean, I've thought this all along. Kudos to Al Gore for having the chutzpah and the honesty to say it like it is, even though if it was 5 years too late. So, January WASDE report came out. Reduced the projected yield to 152.8, the projected crop to 12.447. Just an absolute disaster of a 12.4 billion bushel corn crop, right? It's the third biggest one ever. And yet we have 745 as a projected carryout million bushels, a ratio of 5.5. That's the second lowest projected stocks-to-use ratio at the end of the crop year in history. The only one lower was in 1996, or 1996, right, John, or 95? 96. And right, that crop year. Okay? So that's kind of the pickle we find ourselves in, and of course, if we see the relationship between stocks to use and price, in this case, we get the highest price on record. Why did we get a higher price than we did in 2008? Because those $7 and $8 or almost $8 corn prices in July of 2008 had very little corn sold at that price. This year, the prices started up before harvest, and we've had a lot of corn sold at high prices, and so the annual average is much higher. If we look at total production, we back out the amount for ethanol. Here's what's available above ethanol, available from the corn supply. Now, you can see that the trend is downward on that number. Now, to be honest, we have to take the DDGs that come out of that, put them back in the feed supply. So if we take total feed usage plus DDGs, it's basically been flat for about 8 years now. That to me is probably a good kind of a trend that we can count on for the next 2 or 3 years as the renewable fuel standard still goes up 600 million gallons per year. So flat supplies of corn for feed. If you look at what we have available from milo, what we have available from oats, what we have available from wheat, those are getting smaller. So how do you grow a livestock and poultry sector when you have smaller supplies of total feed available to you? You're going to have to get more efficient, or we're going to have lower supplies, and I think the latter is the case, at least for the foreseeable future, that we're going to have lower animal numbers, lower meat supplies, and higher meat prices in the United States over the next few years. Here's the relationship between corn and oil. Again, positive, and that really gets positive once oil gets up of about $70 per barrel. $70 a gallon. That would be a little pricey. But still, there's a lot of talk, well, we're going back to 140, and maybe we are. I think the real price and everything I read says, $80 to $100, $105 a barrel is kind of where oil ought to be. And if it gets higher than that, one thing it will do is it will choke off world economic activity and slow the world economy down, and we'll see some pushback, some big-time pushback, I think, if oil gets back up to where it was before. So I don't expect it to go a lot higher. I think there's going to be some supply response there. Corn, so much for my new range for corn production, corn prices. Maybe I need to draw another box up here as the new range, but still challenging the highs, and the futures say we're going to stay there, by the way. We look at soybean meal, same thing there, not to the same degree, obviously, and hopefully we're going to get a little help from the South Americans. Feed costs, the index of feed costs that I have, corn and soybean meal to make that 16% crude protein diet, up about $100 a ton right now from a year ago. And so we've driven these costs up. This is the forecast from my model that's based on Iowa State University's estimated costs and returns, and the average for this year right now, as of day before yesterday, was $83.35 per hundredweight carcass. Now I know the best of you in here are probably $4 or $5 below that, and if you've done a really good job of buying corn, you've got projected break-evens that are lower too. Again, it depends on what you've done and what you will do. It's your actions are going to have a lot to say about what kind of year you had. Now, that's kind of the bad side. Cost side is there. I've told a lot of people you're going to have record hog prices and record revenues, and you may not get to keep any of it at the end of the year. Okay? That's very possible. But this one right here is really a positive, and it's one of the more positive things I've seen in a while. I've talked for several years that I'm really concerned about the pattern of these demand indexes. Here's chicken, here's pork, here's beef. Again, on a 1985 equals 100 base. Okay, it's an index. It goes back to that time period and says, where are we relative to that? And we've been going down ever since the Atkins diet went away. Okay? And 2010 is another point on that downtrend. But 2010's annual number is not indicative of where we were at the end of the year. In November, the pork demand index for that month was 14% higher than it was a year earlier. If we look at chicken, it was 5% higher. Beef was 2% higher. If we look at the charts of those, you can see these extremely, very strong moves toward the end of the year above zero. Here's pork up 14%. But look where we were at the beginning of the year. It was pretty much awful. I mean, the January index for pork was down 10.5% relative to a year before. And so we've been overcoming those negative numbers as we've gone through the year, still negative on average, but really a lot of momentum as we go to the end of the year. And the reason is that we're finally getting the higher prices at farm and wholesale level passed along to the retail level. And especially true in the pork industry. We set 6 records last year on retail pork prices. They fell a bit in November and December. We got cattle choice cutouts, I'll talk in a minute, $172 last week. These beef prices are headed to records. I don't think there's any question about that. We're going to see that as we go through 2011. The chicken prices aren't far from it, and we thought maybe the chicken guys were going to grow their output and push chicken prices down. They've all kind of pulled back in the last couple of months. And I'll talk about that too. So a lot of positive looking things on demand and relative supplies of other meats. On the export side, If you look at quantities, it was pretty easy to look last fall, summer and fall and say, man, what's the matter here? We're below a year ago. We're just barely staying above a year ago on a year-to-date basis. And then, kaboom, here comes November. Huge growth, 7% above a year ago. Now, the important thing, though, is this. What was one of the factors, and to my mind, the main factor in those lower export quantities? High prices. Okay? They have downward sloping demand curves too. If we jack up the price of products going into those other markets, even if their currency is stronger, which it has been in general, the prices are high. So we look at total value of exports, and they're near record high. And that's the number that really has the most influence on your hog demand. So, value of exports approaching record high. I think it's going to be record high as we go through 2011. The value of byproduct exports up around $50 million per month. A big number too, and that contributes to hog values as well. As far as countries, Mexico, again challenging Japan as our largest export market for pork cuts. If we put pork variety meats plus pork cuts together, Mexico's far and away the leader on volume. Japan is still far and away the leader on value, so we can't ignore Japan, especially in its contribution to demand. Here is Korea, been much higher in the past a few times, was growing toward the end of last year. The tariff rate quota applies to 60,000 tons, I think was the number, right? I think the number for this last year on pork exports to Korea is going to be somewhere around 75,000 tons. So it's no small number that they're putting in at zero tariff. All right, so it's a big deal, I think, for the U.S. pork industry, and as a precursor for a free trade agreement that's going to go into effect over the next several years. The decimation of the Korean pork industry is probably to our benefit. Now, I hate to take much joy in that because it's a real tough thing for them and it's a tough thing for their people. But this is a country that really is going to discover that they're probably better off buying pork from us than trying to raise it themselves. And kind of like Taiwan was a few years ago. So I don't know that we'll ever see their industry build back to where it was. We're going to offer them some alternatives, and they can probably reduce the cost of pork to their consumers by importing from us. Beef and chicken. Well, the beef industry is going to be profitable this year, I think. They've got high-priced corn, but especially at the cow-calf level. And one of the reasons is we keep shrinking this cow herd. I mean, the beef cow herd is low. It's the lowest beef cow inventory since 1963. If we look at cow slaughter last year, we slaughtered about 9% more beef cows last year than we did the year before. And that is in the face of two kind of situations that you wouldn't think would cause for a lot of cows to be slaughtered. Number one is the cow-calf sector was generally profitable. $110, $120, $125 calves, you can make money on cows at that. Number two is we didn't have a real drought anywhere in the country to speak of that caused real short grass conditions. And normally we get big liquidations of cows in Texas or somewhere there's no grass for 6 months and we get cows liquidated, and we've seen that happen in the southeast. That really didn't happen last year. We had pretty good grazing conditions about everywhere. So it left me last summer going, why are we killing so many cows? And Ron Plain came up with an answer that I think is absolutely right. And he said, it's the economy, stupid. And if you look, I think we'll get these data when USDA comes out with their number of operations data this spring. I think this liquidation was mainly in small herds. And it was in small herds for two reasons. Number one is, those people that own 30, 50 cows or something like that may have been in situations with the economy and their jobs that they needed the money. And if they weren't in that situation, they were certainly in a situation where they couldn't keep subsidizing their cow habit. Okay? And I think that's where this liquidation came from. When I've talked to kind of professional cattlemen, there weren't any of them that were reducing the cow herd to speak of. It was the small herds, I think, that's going to account for this. And we won't know that for sure until the USDA data comes out in April on livestock operations. But we'll see if that is right, then if Ron Plain's theory was correct. And if not, I'll just take all this back. We'll blame Ron. The calf crop, the smallest calf crop since 1950. The two smallest since 1950, the last 2 years. With a smaller cow herd, I don't see any way on this green earth that we can have more calves this next year. They can't increase efficiency enough to get that done. So we got a smaller calf crop coming. If we look at the supply of feeder cattle outside of feed yards last July, we're down 2.6% relative to a year earlier. The number of heifers being retained for beef cow replacements was down 2.2. I think you see the pattern here. Now, we have been placing more cattle in feed yards the last few months. And the question is, where are they coming from? Okay? And one of the things is they haven't been going to wheat pasture, because wheat pasture situation is pretty bad in West Texas and the southern plains, and so they've been getting placed into feed yards. Darrell Peel in his at Oklahoma State in his newsletter this week said he doesn't think there's any questions that we have pulled placements forward. So what does that mean? Well, that means when we get to April and March and May, we're going to see placements drop, and we're going to see fed cattle prices and supplies in the second half of this year tighter than what we've seen before, and we're already at $178 choice beef. So I think it makes a very strong case for increased prices. Production last year was up 1.8%, with a lot of that coming in the fourth quarter. We dipped into that supply of market-ready cattle pretty heavily, and now we're running below year ago, and that number is probably going to keep that way for a while here. We may get a blip above year ago levels as we go into the spring because of these higher winter placements, but I think the second half of the year is certainly going to be down. Here's that cutout value I was talking about. You can see $30 higher than last year, and that difference has been holding for some time. It really started in the fourth quarter, and there's the reason they slaughtered so many cattle, is the cutout value was pretty strong in the fourth quarter. On the chicken side, I was really afraid in November and December that we were going to have a damn the torpedoes action by the chicken business. They had started an expansion last spring and summer with broiler egg sets growing 4 and 5% and sometimes more over a year earlier. And of course, subsequent placements of chicks were the same way. The broiler flock had started growing again, and then high feed costs came along. Now, for those of us with some gray hair, we know that a few years ago that broiler companies didn't necessarily manage for profits. They managed for market share. And that's a good strategy when your market's growing all the time. Okay? And so when the first time came that they started losing some money and they were still trying to build market share and nobody would blink, they lost a lot of money. And I'm looking at this going, we could see this happen again. Tyson had a pretty good year. Matter of fact, one of their best years ever. They had some cash. From what I understand, JBS Swift, Pilgrim's Pride, has a little bit of cash. It's called the country of Brazil behind them. And so, if you get those two in a real shooting match, it could get bloody. But in the last 6 weeks, we've seen this whole thing slow down. You see egg sets go back to year ago levels. Placements don't show it right here, but if you go over here early 2011, they're back to year-ago levels, or very close to it. I think some rationality has taken hold here, and they've said, we've got a whole lot of chicken dark meat in the freezers, and a whole lot of chicken period in the freezers, and these costs are going up, and they've pulled back. They've really been pretty rational about it. And so I think that's going to be very positive as we go through this year. Here's the big reason, of course, they were losing money. This is an estimate that a colleague of mine, Dr. Carl Skolds, put together on estimated broiler returns. Here's the reason they were growing last summer, but you can see those go away as corn prices went up during the year. And so they've certainly pulled back. So, competitor meats. I think both are poised to be positive for pork. On beef, for sure, I believe we're going to have tighter beef supplies, record high retail prices on beef. On the chicken side, current higher output and higher values, but the returns have certainly been negative, have gotten close to zero or negative. Production may not drive prices lower in 2011, and so I think that's going to be a quite encouraging thing for pork and hogs. Which brings us to the critters we know and love best. Key issues for this year. Feed costs, it's one of those things. If I had the David Letterman thing, like number 10 through number 1 through number 9 would be feed costs. I mean, it just, Ron used to say the top 10 things and the first 7 of them were feed costs. I'd probably have to make it a little more than that now. Hog numbers, December Hogs and Pigs report said that basically slaughter numbers this year are going to be very much like the slaughter numbers in 2010. I've got them down 1/10 of 1%. Okay, not a lot of reduction, but certainly not growth of any magnitude. Expansion, the breeding herd grew 8,000 head from September 1 to December 1. At that same time, we not only ran the highest sow slaughter of the year, we also had some of the highest gilt retention levels of the year. Now, those kind of don't fit very well. But I think what we had was the different ends of the cost spectrum here in our business were acting differently. Those higher cost producers, as grain prices started up again in the fourth quarter, I think they and their bankers had a little discussion and said, do you really want to stay in the hog business? And the ones at the bad end of the cost distribution probably were where those sows were coming from. On the other hand, the ones at the good end of the cost distribution, who may have done a better job of managing input costs, they were filling some empty sow barns. And I think that's the reason we kind of have this dichotomy of action in the fourth quarter. Only time's going to tell whether that's the case, but I believe that's going to be what we see in the data. Demand, domestic was soft early, very good toward the end, and exports have been very good based on value. And with a continued relatively weak dollar, I don't see any reason for exports to slow down as we go through 2011, unless we get some real big hiccups from, imagine the Russians might get a little chippy about something. They draw random numbers, I think, on that one. So anyway, financial positions have improved. This is I'm not going to take credit. It's John Lawrence. If you sold a pig per month, put the money in a bank paying 0% interest, which is what banks pay, you would had about $800 back when we began the 2007-8, or in the fall of 2007. It went down to about $150. It's back up to about a little over $300 as of December. This is what the futures suggest for the next year you could do if you locked in futures as of earlier this week. Not a lot of profits there, but some. Here's where you could have been had you locked in what was offered last June before feed prices go up. So, I don't bring that to you to make you feel bad or anything, but the market offers the opportunities, and you need to be looking at it. I heard a presentation last spring, really good one, and there was a statement in it that I really hadn't heard before, and he said, you don't look at futures markets as predictions. Look at futures markets as offers. I thought that's kind of a good thing. I wish I'd thought of that. I mean, it really is. Every day, somebody in Chicago is offering you money for all of your pigs for the next 12 months. Okay? You can take it or leave it. I mean, that's your decision. But they are real offers with real money behind those. It's not completely risk-free. I know that. I know that bases bounce around and all kinds of things can happen. And you need to have your banker on board. But those are offers. They're bona fide offers for your production. Okay, the December Hogs and Pigs report, about as expected. There are few surprising numbers, and the real surprises were these farrowing intentions that were down significantly more than what the breeding herd is. And I don't think those are going to play out personally. I think we're probably going to get a few more litters farrowed than what the report indicated. I just can't believe we're going to go backwards on productivity, especially when getting litters out of sows is of such value with these kind of feed prices. We did go back to 2% growth on litter size. We'd been below that for a couple of quarters, so back we are on that one, and that's one of the things that leads me to say that we really have some robust productivity growth. Back in October, and this is based off the September Hogs and Pigs report, here's where we expected slaughter to be during the fall. That's the red line. And here's where it was, green. Notice last year we had these numbers that were significantly below the year before, last winter. I have never in my career seen output numbers affected as much by the quality of a corn crop as they were the 2009 corn crop. And then affected again the opposite direction by the good quality of the 2010 corn crop. I mean, I've never seen when you can just kind of put a pencil on when we got new crop corn both years and see the difference in productivity. And we certainly saw that last fall. Not only in hog numbers, but as we'll see in a minute, in weights. Here's what the December Hogs and Pigs report says, and again, the red line is just a straight projection off of that. Percent change off of weekly slaughter, and that's what I usually use, but because of these performance issues with the corn crop quality, I went back and averaged the last 5 years before 2009 to get that seasonal pattern, and then used the December Hogs and Pigs report number to come up with the kind of purple line here. And notice it says that we will be lower in the fourth quarter, somewhat higher in the third quarter, but it also says we're going to run slaughter down below 2.1 million head here this spring. And so something we ought to watch for. If we look at weights, of course, not even small horses, just horses. I mean, these things have been huge since last fall. We did get the largest 1 week drop in weight, so this is mandatory price reporting barrows and gilts. About 95% of all the barrows and gilts, real time, it's probably the best weight data we have. If you look at, USDA has 3 different ones. They have total hog weights, which they estimate, and then they revise dramatically, normally 2 weeks later. They've got barrow and gilt weights that come out 2 weeks late, and those include all barrows and gilts, off hogs, everything. These are mainly just top barrows and gilts that go through mandatory price reporting packers. And so you can see it's a very representative sample. I think it's probably the best weight data. And we did get those weights down last week for the first time. That's the biggest drop since June in 1 week. So maybe we're making some headway. Why did we get this large? Well, the pigs liked that feed. It tasted good. It had more nutrients in it, and we were running up against slaughter capacity. I mean, we weren't too far. It wasn't real tight. It wasn't certainly a 98 situation, but we couldn't kill very many more per week, and they just kept getting bigger. And we didn't level it off until we got to November, and now we're finally pulling those weights down. Pork production last year was down 2.3%. We've been +4 for the fourth quarter. We're up about 2.5% so far this year. That number is going to get back and be very close to where it was a year ago when we get the weights back in line. I mentioned cold storage a while ago. Total meat and poultry in cold storage, not a real problem over here. I mean, relative to history, some of the lower numbers, but look where chicken is. And they've been going up, and I think they're going to level off here as we go through the spring. But still, not a good situation on the amount of chicken in cold storage. Pork is in pretty good shape. The lowest numbers for turkey that we've seen in many, many years. And those are going to stay low as we go through the spring. So we're not in bad shape on total supplies. The chicken industry sure has to get a handle, especially on dark meat supplies. Cutout value fell sharply in the fall. It leveled off, and we've maintained that cutout value during all those big slaughter weeks and all those big hogs as we went through, and we've certainly put about $8 on it since the first of the year. The hog price fell farther. Isn't that a surprise? I mean, it always does. The demand at the farm level is more inelastic than the demand at the wholesale level, and so a given quantity change has a bigger impact. We did get a kind of a counter-seasonal rally here during November and December, and we traded them back up to 75, close to break-even levels on the average calculations that I have. Packer margins have been really good. Now, this allows some room to rally hogs when supplies get a little tighter. You're not going to rally hogs much with supplies big. It also invites some competition, I think, and there's some potential competition out there. But packer margins have been very, very good this last year. I don't want to wish anybody bad on that. We all need to make money. I think it really provides room for a rally in hog prices. If we look where the futures are as of this is day before yesterday. I got the 21st. I pulled these Monday. This is where the futures will be, averaging almost 90 cents a pound for the year. A huge. That is the Iowa. That's the average futures price on that, and obviously the record high for all time would be set at those levels. Sow slaughter for the first week of this year about 4% lower than a year ago. If we look at that as a percentage of the sow herd, it's down about 1%. So we're hanging in there, kind of normal kind of sow slaughter right now. I don't think there's a lot of change going on. And then the red line here is the same one as the cost line that I showed you early on. I've superimposed prices for next year. As of the 24th, profits of about $4.64 per head. Now, if I put today's prices in, those are going to be better, probably up around $7 or $8 a head. And that's going to be the best number I've seen for projected profits on hogs for 2011 since, probably back in November sometime when we had corn maybe $1 lower than where it is now. So, certainly not a banner year for profits, Going to be one of the great price years we've ever had, but the profit situation is going to be another story. Whoop, went the wrong way. If we look at forecasts, and I need to make these bigger numbers. But if I made them bigger numbers, then you could read them. That'd be a problem. So, Missouri, Iowa State, Livestock Marketing Information Center, and myself, quarterly, some growth in the first quarter is what I have. Most of us do. LMIC's got it down a little bit. Then, pretty much next year until the fourth quarter, the same as last year until the fourth quarter, I got it down 1.4. Again, down 1/10 of 1%. We all think it's going to be down a bit. LMIC a little more than others. For price forecasts, and I don't redo price forecasts very often. I usually do them out of the December the Hogs and Pigs report, and I leave them set. For better or worse, that's based off of what we know about supply. And so I've left mine alone. I've got them up in the upper 80s for the second and third quarter. The futures market now says 95 and 94 on average for those two quarters as of today. Now that is the futures price. You'd have to take a basis off of that. If I had an average of 85 to 88, I'd probably have some $90 hogs in there sometime during the quarter. But still, nowhere near as high as where the futures are. 89.51 average for the year futures this afternoon. Just before I came down here, I got them pretty close to the close. Clearly a record and well above anything that the four of us have from a fundamental analysis, supply and demand analysis. Now, what does that mean? Well, it could mean that the people trading futures are cockeyed idiots. But what it really means is the futures market in general right now is trading far stronger demand than what I've got figured in. And I'm kind of bullish about demand, as you can tell anyway, and yet they've got a stronger demand factor in there than that. They've got the same supply numbers we had. The market does. Now, somebody might have better supply numbers. I don't know how they would, but that's possible. I think they're just trading stronger demand. Now, is that coming from real demand? Is it coming from speculation? What is it coming from? I can't tell you. But it's one of those things, this is the gift horse, and maybe you ought to take some of their money. Now, with that said, I'm going to put that June contract up there that traded at 99.45 today, and I don't think that's showing a whole lot of topping action yet. Okay? So, I think I would have a plan in place to price hogs and price them pretty aggressively. When these charts start showing you some evidence that they're making a top, I will point out that summer contracts historically have peaked in the first half of May sometime. So it's a long time between now and then. And perhaps they're going to run that far, but boy, this is a pretty steep incline that we've been running up here recently. And I don't know if you're going to have enough juice to get there to get much higher in May. I think the futures market's offering you some great opportunities here. Those are some $18, $20 per head profits for the summer months, even with costs where they are. Pretty big numbers. So you need to balance your need for profits versus your situation with your financial condition. And obviously, if you're going to do something on the futures markets or with options, you're going to have your banker along with you on that. Most people ask me, well, what are you going to do about feed? Cry, pretty much. That's about all we can do at this point for this crop. Now, what's going to happen next year? Well, if I could forecast the weather, I would tell you that, because I think we're really into a weather market here. We may get a little help out of the South American soybean crop that could push soybean prices a little lower and allow corn to be competitive at a slightly lower price as we go into planting. I don't see a lot of that happening because world demand for soybean and soybean oil is very, very strong. If we get into any kind of a hiccup with this crop, I kind of shudder to think what happens next summer. Because, again, the economics are in favor of ethanol at the moment. And even if it doesn't, now we have a 600 million gallon higher renewable fuel standard in 2012 than we do in 2011. I will point out one important thing here, and we have to think about this as we go through. Since the ethanol business is making more ethanol than they're required, they're generating what's called RINs. Okay? Some of you in here, you can kind of think of those as PIC certificates. Okay? Those ethanol makers can use those in the future to account for their part of the renewable fuel standard when it's not profitable to make ethanol. So if we get into a bad situation next year, they can use those RINs that are generated, and there is a market that develops for RINs. They can trade them, just like we did PIC certificates back in the 80s. Okay, it's kind of the same concept. And so, since they're making more than they have to this year, they could get in a situation where we have a tight corn supply, it's not profitable to make ethanol, they could use some RINs and reduce the pressure on the corn crop next year. But I don't think it's going to be a huge deal. If there's not much keeps me awake at night, but if there is one, it would be what happens if we get a 1988 drought this next year. And that's kind of the thing that I've been talking about for a long time, and it's going to happen one of these times. It's one of those things, if you say the same thing long enough, it'll probably be true someday. That one is going to happen. It's been 23 years. And that's the longest period in all of Elwyn Taylor's tree ring data, I think 400 or 600 years or something like that has been in Iowa between droughts. So we're due, and we couldn't really handle one very well this year. There's not a lot of options there. I think as I go forward, if I'm thinking about being in this business, I'm going to probably just pencil in some costs for every bushel of corn, trying to put a ceiling on my corn, my feed prices. Last summer at Pork Expo, some of you may have been there, I suggested that you might want to buy some $5 calls. And I don't know if anybody laughed out loud, but I don't think anybody really thought, I think most people thought I was a little goofy. That would have been a pretty good idea, it looks like. Okay? And again, we can handle a small disaster, most of us can, but it's the big disaster that we probably need insurance for. And you buy insurance on your buildings all the time, and your house and everything, and you never go back and say, gee, I sure wish I hadn't done that. That's exactly what you're doing with options. So I would think that through and decide how much risk you can stand. I think it's going to be a really important characteristic of the successful pork producer in the next few years. With that, if you're interested, I write the daily livestock report, or I do half the writing. Alton Kalo at Steiner Consulting Group does the other half for the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. You can go there and subscribe. And of course, as Dale pointed out, National Hog Farmer's North American Preview e-letter at nationalhogfarmer.com. Again, those are brought to you by sponsors that we'd sure like for you to look them up.